1719 Carolina Assembly Racial Codes. In 1719, the Carolina Assembly enacted a series of racial codes designed to regulate the lives of enslaved people and free people of African descent, reinforcing the racial hierarchy of colonial society. These laws were part of the broader development of the slave codes in the American colonies. They sought to control the behavior of enslaved individuals, limit their rights, and prevent them from gaining power or status in society. Key aspects of these racial codes included restrictions on movement. Enslaved individuals were forbidden to leave their master's property without permission. Regulation of free blacks. Laws were enacted to curtail the rights and privileges of free people of African descent, including restrictions on land ownership and participation in civic life. Harsh punishments. Violations of these codes often resulted in severe punishments, including whipping, branding, or execution. Control of social interactions. The codes sought to prevent interaction between enslaved Africans and European colonists, especially in the context of rebellion or dissent. These racial codes played a crucial role in shaping the development of race-based slavery in the southern colonies, reinforcing white supremacy and the institutionalization of racial inequality. What happens with Native Americans that had, or were presumed to have had Negro blood? Native Americans who were believed to have Negro blood during the colonial and antebellum periods often faced complex and harsh racial classifications and legal restrictions. The presence of African ancestry among indigenous people was often used to undermine their tribal status, rights, and social standing. Here are some of the key impacts. 1. Legal and social marginalization. Native Americans with African ancestry were frequently classified as Negro or mulatto under colonial and later American racial laws, which restricted their rights. These laws often denied them the ability to own land, vote, serve in the military, or testify in court, depending on the state and time period. 2. Loss of tribal identity. Many tribes who intermarried with or included people of African descent were often denied recognition by colonial authorities or later U.S. government officials. This sometimes led to the loss of legal status as Native Americans and exclusion from tribal roles, preventing them from claiming land or receiving benefits tied to indigenous identity. 3. Slavery and forced labor. Native Americans who were believed to have African ancestry were more likely to be enslaved or forced into servitude. Racial codes and laws in the colonies and later the United States equated them with African-descended people, subjecting them to similar conditions of bondage. 4. Exclusion from tribal membership. In some instances, tribal nations themselves excluded members with African ancestry due to pressure from colonial or U.S. authorities or internal divisions. This practice continued into the 19th and 20th centuries when certain tribes sought federal recognition or tried to maintain cultural purity as a strategy to protect land and resources. 5. Racial intermarriage laws. Many colonies and states had laws prohibiting intermarriage between Native Americans and African-descended people. If a Native person married an African-descended person, then their descendants were often classified as Negro and stripped of Native legal and social standing. Overall, Native Americans with African ancestry experienced racial discrimination from both colonial governments and at times, from within their own communities, leading to a loss of identity, rights, and protections. How did this affect the numbers of slaves on the plantation? The classification of Native Americans with African ancestry as Negro or mulatto under colonial and early U.S. laws directly impacted the numbers of enslaved individuals on plantations in several ways. 1. Increase in the enslaved population. Broadened definition of enslavable people by classifying Native Americans with African ancestry as Negro or mulatto. Plantation owners and colonial authorities expanded the pool of people who could be legally enslaved. This increased the number of individuals subject to slavery, as indigenous people with African ancestry were often presumed to be part of the enslaved African population. Native American enslavement. While many indigenous people were initially enslaved through wars and raids in the early colonial period, this practice dwindled over time. However, those with mixed African ancestry remained vulnerable to enslavement, thus adding to the labor force on plantations, especially in colonies like South Carolina, where both indigenous and African labor were utilized early on. 2. Impact on slave codes and legal status. Erasure of native identity. Once Native Americans with African ancestry were legally defined as Negro or mulatto, their tribal affiliations were ignored, and they were placed under the same legal constraints as enslaved Africans. This practice made it easier for slave owners to justify the continued enslavement of individuals with indigenous ancestry, further increasing the number of enslaved people without distinguishing between African and native bloodlines. Multi-generational enslavement. The children of mixed native and African ancestry individuals were often born into slavery, adding to the enslaved population. Slave codes dictated that the status of the mother determined the status of the child, so the offspring of enslaved Native American and African women were born into bondage, regardless of their father's ancestry or their native heritage. 3. Broader availability of forced labor. Labor for large plantations. Southern colonies, particularly in the Carolinas, had large-scale plantations that required a significant labor force. By broadening the definition of enslaved individuals to include those with native ancestry and African ancestry, planters had a larger pool of laborers to exploit. This was especially important in labor-intensive industries like rice, indigo, and cotton production. Legal flexibility for slaveholders. Racial ambiguity gave slaveholders and colonial officials more flexibility to enslave individuals of mixed ancestry. The colonial government's desire to increase the labor pool meant they were more likely to classify people with any African ancestry as enslaved, regardless of their native heritage. 4. Racialization of slavery. Cementing of racial slavery. The inclusion of Native Americans with African ancestry into the enslaved population contributed to the solidification of race-based slavery. Over time, slavery became more rigidly defined by race, and anyone with African ancestry, even in small percentages, was subject to the harsh realities of enslavement. This further increased the numbers of enslaved people on plantations and reinforced the racial hierarchy. In summary, the classification of Native Americans with African ancestry as part of the enslaved population not only increased the number of enslaved individuals on plantations but also contributed to the entrenchment of racial slavery in colonial America. By broadening the legal definition of who could be enslaved, plantation owners were able to increase their labor force, which was critical to the success of large-scale agricultural production. What are the chances that the majority of the slaves during that time had native ancestry? The chances that a significant portion of enslaved people in the colonial period had native ancestry are plausible but varied depending on time, region, and the interactions between Native American and African populations. While it's difficult to determine exact numbers, several factors suggest that many enslaved individuals had some degree of native ancestry. 1. Early enslavement of Native Americans. Initial enslavement of indigenous peoples. In the early colonial period, particularly in places like the Carolinas, Native Americans were frequently captured and enslaved during wars, raids, and as a result of alliances with other native tribes. These enslaved indigenous people were sold into the transit. Were some tribal people called Negroes before admixture? Yes, some indigenous people, particularly in the southeastern United States, were labeled as Negro or mulatto by colonial authorities in census records even before any documented admixture with people of African descent. This racial misclassification occurred for several reasons. 1. European misunderstandings of race. European concepts of race. European colonists often had limited understanding of the various indigenous peoples they encountered. They sometimes used blanket racial categories like Negro, mulatto, or black for individuals with darker skin, regardless of their actual ancestry. Many Native Americans, especially those from southeastern tribes like the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others, were darker-skinned compared to Europeans, leading to their misclassification as Negroes in colonial records. Simplified racial classifications. Colonial governments and officials relied on simplified racial categories to classify people for legal and social purposes. Rather than distinguishing between different indigenous groups, colonists often lumped them into broad racial categories that included African-descended people, leading to Native people being misidentified. 2. Legal and social marginalization. Enslavement and legal codes. In some cases, Native Americans who were enslaved or captured during conflicts were labeled as Negro or mulatto to facilitate their enslavement. The racial codes and laws governing slavery were primarily designed around African ancestry, so categorizing Native people as Negro allowed colonists to justify their enslavement under those laws. This practice was especially common in colonies like South Carolina, where both Native Americans and Africans were enslaved during the 17th and 18th centuries. Loss of tribal identity. Native people who were forcibly removed from their communities or who assimilated into colonial society sometimes lost their tribal identity over time. Without strong connections to their native heritage, they could be racially categorized by appearance alone, often as Negro or mulatto. This was especially true in cases where indigenous people adopted European clothing, language, or other customs, further obscuring their native identity in the eyes of colonial authorities. 3. Pressure to classify by race. Colonial and early American censuses. Early censuses and legal documents often used limited racial categories, typically white, Negro, or mulatto. Native people, especially those living outside of recognized tribal communities or in close proximity to African-descended populations, were frequently misclassified as Negro or mulatto simply because there were no accurate categories for them in the legal or census systems. Mixed communities. In regions where Native American, African, and European populations lived in close proximity, misclassification was more likely. Colonial authorities tended to lump people of color into broad categories to simplify governance and legal control. This often meant that Native Americans who did not fit into the dominant racial categories were defaulted to Negro or mulatto. 4. Colonial policies and racial codes. South Carolina and the Carolinas. The Carolinas, in particular, had a robust Indian slave trade. During the late 1600s and early 1700s, where Native Americans were captured, enslaved, and sold alongside African people. Many of these Native Americans were classified as Negroes or mulattoes because the colonial racial system focused on enslaving non-white people. This practice contributed to the blurring of racial lines between Native and African people and created records that listed some indigenous people as Negro even before any actual admixture occurred. Racialization of enslavement. As racial slavery became more entrenched, racial codes increasingly defined people by physical appearance and ancestry. Any non-European people with darker skin tones, including Native Americans, could be labeled Negro and subjected to the same conditions as enslaved Africans, regardless of their true ancestry. Conclusion. Yes, Many Native Americans were labeled as Negro or mulatto in colonial records and legal documents before any documented admixture with African-descended people. This misclassification often stemmed from European misunderstandings of race, legal efforts to justify enslavement, and the simplified racial categories used by colonial governments. Over time, this led to the erasure of many Native identities in official records, further complicating the historical understanding of these communities and their descendants.